Vivid imaging is the mental rehearsal that CEOs and elite athletes have long understood is the secret of success. So let's talk about the mental edge of high performers. Grab your cup of tea and let's dive into it. Steve Jobs used to famously prepare for his Apple presentations by vividly imagining his performance, the unveiling of his latest products. He would vividly imagine his pacing and the reaction from the audience. And he's not the only creative genius that would engage in this vivid visualization, in mental rehearsal. Albert Einstein said, "If my work isn't going well, I lay down in the middle of the workday and gaze at the ceiling, while listening and visualizing what goes on in my imagination." Now, visualization is not this modern day woohoo concept. It is something that has actually been around in some form for tens of thousands of years. So let's talk about the ancient art of visualization. Now, the ancient roots of visualization was something that really caught my attention when I read Norman Vincent Peale's book, Positive Imaging. And he refers to cave paintings that were found in France and in Spain that date back 25,000 years. And in these caves, the hunters actually had on the wall images of them hunting. So, in a way, this was vivid imaging. They were picturing the successful achievement of their goal. They were visualizing those goals. In this primitive ritual, they were literally painting it on the walls of their home so that they could connect with those images. In the book, Peale says, if a person persistently imagines failure, life will try its best to develop that picture as fact. But if one imagines success, it will similarly strongly tend to develop that image as fact. He also says, imaging is a kind of laser beam of the imagination, a shaft of mental energy by which the desired goal or outcome is pictured so vividly by the conscious mind that the unconscious mind accepts it and is activated by it. This releases powerful internal forces that can bring astonishing changes in the life of the person doing the imaging. So essentially, visualization is being positioned a little bit like osmosis. So if an idea can be activated in your conscious mind, then eventually this can permeate through to your subconscious mind. And when this reaches your subconscious mind, this is when it can really take hold of your behavior and it can drive your performance. But to be really clear, this is not just about positive thinking. This is about vivid visualizations that are tremendously detailed. So let's move on to point 2, and that is the neuroscience of visualization. Why visualization can work so well is that the brain has been shown to not easily be able to differentiate between what is vividly imagined and what is real. So detailed visualizations for desired outcomes can help you to actually achieve that thing. There was some research that was done in the 1970s by a sports psychologist where he was working with the US Olympic team at the time. And he worked with athletes to add a mental rehearsal component to their physical training. So, as a part of their physical training, they also had to vividly imagine things like their races, their routines, and their performances. And what this research showed was that the athletes that had complemented their physical training with mental rehearsal as well outperformed the athletes that were purely only physically practicing. But again, this was not about vague optimism. The sports psychologist was working really closely with the athletes to make sure that this was a detailed visual process. So they, for example, had to imagine themselves from the first person perspective. They had to include things like physical sensation, so their muscle tension and their breath rhythm. They had to rehearse under pressure, and they had to visualize successful execution repeatedly. So, what they were essentially engaging in is a form of neural conditioning. And this has been something that has been reflected in other research as well. So, for example, there was a very famous study that was done that compared people who were physically practicing piano to people that were purely only mentally practicing piano. So, they were divided into two groups to either practice physically or practice mentally over 5 days. And what it showed was that the participants that were practicing purely mentally were actually developing neural pathways that were similar to the participants that were practicing physically. So, for example, their brain activity showed that there was reorganization happening in the motor cortex area of their brain. So, this is the area of your brain that is related to your fine movements, for example. So, the participants that were rehearsing mentally weren't just daydreaming, they were actually rewiring their brain. And again, this shows us that the brain can't easily differentiate between what is imagined and that real experience. So, sticking with your brain, let's talk about triggering your reticular activating system, because this is a really important part of why visualization works so well. Your reticular activating system is the system that tells your brain what to focus on. So, when you think about all of the noise and all of the stimuli that you are exposed to, all of the thoughts that could potentially be in your mind, your reticular activating system is what filters that information for you. So, when you engage in visualization or vivid imaging, then you are triggering your reticular activating system to understand what is most important to you and to be able to focus in on that thing. So, for example, say you become really interested in speaking opportunities. Because you have triggered your reticular activating system, then that means that you will start to notice speaking opportunities more than prior to you having this thought. So, if you are engaging in vivid visualizations, in vivid imaging more intensely, then your reticular activating system is going to be even more heightened to focus on what it is that you want to prioritize. And your thoughts here are really important, which leads me to number 4, and that is you become what you believe. In the book Positive Imaging, Peel says, images that other people hold of us do impinge on our lives, but the images that affect us most strongly are the self-images that we develop as we move through the years. So this works a little bit like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Whatever we believe about ourselves, we become. So this links nicely to self-perception theory in psychology, for example, that says that we know who we are by what we observe about ourselves. So, say for example, you start to imagine yourself really confidently and really successfully performing in whatever it is that you want to achieve, then your brain starts to see these images as being real life experiences. And then you start to believe about yourself that you are capable, that you are confident, that you are high performing in those things. And you start to develop an identity that is related to that person. And the more that you have an identity that is related to that highest version of yourself, the more likely you are going to be able to achieve that thing, because you have an identity that is linked to that. Your behavior is going to follow the identity that you have created. But keep in mind that this can work in different ways. So if you see yourself as confident, as capable, as high performing in achieving what your goals are, then your actions and your decisions are likely going to reflect that perception that you have for yourself. But if, on the other hand, you have a self-perception of yourself that is doubtful, that is limited, that feels uncertain, then the results that you experience are likely going to mirror that perception that you have for yourself. But again, this is not all about positive thinking, which leads me to point number 5, which is the importance of creating mental contrast for maximum impact. Now, this idea of mental contrast is something that is used in psychology as a way to proactively anticipate the obstacles that you are likely to face in your path. So this is identifying some of the things that could potentially go wrong so that your brain is primed to anticipate these things and then also be ready to overcome them as well. Now, this is something that very famously this swimmer Michael Phelps engaged with. Now, he is one of the most successful athletes of our era, and he used visualization to be able to perform the way that he did. But this wasn't all about positive thinking. As a part of his visualizations, he would anticipate the setbacks that he would have in his races. So, for example, things like a bad start, a slip in his turn, or feeling fatigued, he would anticipate these things so that he could imagine how he was to overcome them. But it's one thing to understand how the top performers engage with visualization and the science that supports this as well. But it's another to put it into practice in your everyday life. So let's talk about visualization in action and some of my tips to make this a really practical part of your everyday routine. My first tip is to start by creating a vision board. Now, if you follow this channel, you would know that vision boarding is something that I have become really interested in the last few years, and that is because of the power of visualization. For me, this is the way to put your visualization right in front of you, to be able to collect images that reflect what your goals are without just having to refer to your own discipline in creating those images for yourself. So you have something in front of you every day. So create a vision board, whether it is a physical vision board that you have somewhere in your house or in your office, or create a digital vision board, which is what I do. I like to create my vision board on Canva. And then as a part of your routine, make sure that you have an opportunity to engage with this regularly. So I, for example, keep my vision board on the desktop of my computer. So I know that without even trying, I am seeing what my vision board is daily. And I'm reinforcing that triggering in my reticular activating system. But the important part is to think about how this can align with your everyday routine, which links nicely to my next tip for putting visualization into action. And that is to find somewhere in your routine that you can habit stack visualization onto. So, for example, I like to have a couple of minutes dedicated to visualization as a part of my yoga routine. So, for example, when I am winding down in my yoga practice, I will finish this with a form of meditation or visualization. So I know that I can spend a little bit of time during that session engaging in visualization. And what has made that such a manageable part of my routine is that I have been able to add that onto something that I am already doing. But I also feel like you don't just need to be sitting in a dark room with your eyes closed to actively be able to engage in visualization. So you might, for example, think about if there are parts of your day that you can engage in positive daydreaming, where you know that you have the opportunity to vividly imagine these things. So this might be, for example, when you are exercising at the gym, or during your yoga practice, or during your Pilates class, or if you are like me and you like to take a lot of walks, then that could be a place that you spend a few minutes making sure that you are actively daydreaming. And walking has been a habit that has been practiced by some of the greatest minds of our era. So it could just be the perfect place for you to practice your visualizations. Thanks so much. If you're interested in all things visualization and vision boarding, then make sure you check out my previous episodes on this topic. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next episode.